Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to wander into a place so isolated, so ancient, that it seems almost forgotten by the world? A place where the air is thick with secrets and the trees have witnessed things that cannot be spoken aloud. There's a forest deep in the heart of Oregon where the lost souls of the past still linger, trapped in time. These souls, restless and seeking revenge, wander endlessly, waiting for someone to replace them. A place where every step you take might be your last, where the trees seem to whisper warnings, and where the very ground beneath your feet feels like it could swallow you whole at any moment. Imagine walking into that forest. Picture it, the trees towering over you, their gnarled branches stretching toward the sky like fingers, clawing at the darkened heavens. The air is thick with mist, swirling around your feet and making it impossible to see more than a few inches in front of you. The eerie silence is deafening until, suddenly, the stillness is shattered by a distant sound. It's a crackling, like dry leaves being crushed underfoot, but there's no one around. No sign of life, no explanation, just the feeling that something or someone is out there, watching. You hear it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, though no one is in sight. You look around, but the mist is so thick, it feels as though you're surrounded by shadows. Your heart races, your pulse quickens, and you can't shake the feeling that you're not alone. The question becomes unavoidable: am I being watched? But it doesn't stop there. As the forest grows darker, you start to hear whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seem to come from all directions. A voice calls out from behind you, so faint you think you must be imagining it. But the air feels charged, heavy with an energy you can't quite understand. You turn to look, and there's nothing. Just the same oppressive silence, the same ominous shadows stretching endlessly into the unknown. And that's when it hits you. This is not just a forest. This is a place where the past hasn't quite let go. A place where the lost souls of those who came before are still trapped, still searching for a way to escape. Their voices echo in the wind, their eyes follow you from the dark corners of the woods, as if beckoning you to join them. You see, Oregon's wilderness has a dark history, one that not many are willing to speak about. Legends tell of those who ventured too deep into the forest and were never seen again. They say the land itself is cursed, that it holds the souls of those who met untimely, violent ends. Souls that cannot move on, souls that are now bound to this place for eternity. And so, with each step, you begin to wonder, am I walking into the unknown, or am I walking into a trap set by those who came before me? Are the whispers just the wind, or are they the voices of the lost calling to you? Are you simply passing through, or are you becoming part of something far darker than you can imagine? But here's the thing, the more you try to escape, the more the forest pulls you in. The trees close in around you, and the mists seem to grow thicker, more suffocating. You realize too late that it isn't just the land that's haunted, it's you, too. You've crossed a line, stepped into a place where the rules of the living no longer apply. And once you're in, there's only one question left. Can you escape, or will you become another lost soul trapped in the darkness forever? This is the Oregon wilderness. A place where fear isn't just an emotion, it's a presence, a living, breathing force that will keep you guessing, keep you second-guessing until the very end. Will you be the one to uncover its secrets? Or will it be you who becomes part of the forest's curse? So the real question is, as you stand in this haunted wilderness, with the mist swirling around you and the whispers growing louder, can you make it out alive? Or will you too become one of the lost souls that the forest claims? The Oregon wilderness is a place of both mystery and terror, a land where the very earth seems to carry the weight of its past, filled with disappearances, legends, and a deep, unsettling silence. For centuries, this sprawling forest has been shrouded in mystery, with countless stories circulating about people who entered, only to vanish without a trace. Those who dared to venture too far into its depths never returned, leaving only a trail of whispers behind them. This is no ordinary forest. It's a place where time seems to have lost its grip, and the line between the living and the dead is dangerously thin. Long before it became a topic of hushed conversations and fearful glances, this land was home to ancient tribes, their stories and spirits woven into the very fabric of the trees. The forest was once their sanctuary, a place where they hunted, gathered, and lived in harmony with nature. But as time moved on, so did they, leaving behind only remnants of their existence, carvings on stone, forgotten burial grounds, and most hauntingly, the souls that lingered long after their people had gone. The legends tell of curses placed upon the land, of vengeful spirits trapped in the forest, waiting for someone to wander too far and unleash them once more. The eerie atmosphere of the forest is not merely the result of superstition. There's a tangible unease that clings to the trees, a weight in the air that presses down on you as you step deeper into its heart. And yet, for centuries, the stories of these hauntings and disappearances were relegated to the realms of folklore, until one day the forest once again began to call to the curious, to the brave, or perhaps the foolish. Enter a group of young adventurers, eager to explore the hidden corners of the world, to seek out what others had only dared to whisper about. They heard the rumors, of course, the tales of people lost to the forest, never to be seen again. But those were just stories, right? Surely the world had moved on from such superstitions. With excitement in their hearts and a sense of invincibility that only youth can provide, they set out one crisp autumn morning to explore the depths of Oregon's most mysterious forest. The fall season was in full swing, and the forest was cloaked in a thick layer of fog, the kind that clings to everything, distorting shapes and muffling sounds. The air was cold, damp, and heavy with the scent of earth and decay. The young explorers, 3 friends, each excited by the promise of adventure, laughed and joked as they hiked through the dense underbrush. Their plans were simple: hike, camp, explore, and see if they could find any signs of the ancient tribes that had once called this land home. What they didn't know, however, was that the forest was watching them, and not in a friendly way. As the group pressed deeper into the wilderness, their initial excitement began to wane. The fog thickened, clinging to their skin and making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. At first, the sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the occasional bird call, were comforting, a reminder that they were still very much a part of the world they knew. But then, something changed. The sounds began to distort, becoming muffled as though the forest itself were trying to block them out. One of the adventurers, a young woman named Sarah, was the first to notice it. She had strayed from the main path to explore a small clearing, and there she saw something that made her skin crawl. A tree, its bark scarred and twisted, seemed to have a symbol carved into it, a symbol that didn't look like anything she had seen before. It was ancient, but it wasn't part of the native tribe's markings. This felt different, more ominous. Sarah called out to her friends, but when they arrived, the symbol was gone. They chalked it up to their overactive imaginations, or perhaps a trick of the fog. But as the day wore on, the feeling of unease only grew. The mist seemed to swallow them whole, and the once familiar path began to feel unfamiliar, disorienting. Each time they checked their map or compass, it seemed as though they were losing ground instead of making progress. The trees loomed larger, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching down to snatch them. And that's when they began to hear it, the sound of something following them, something heavy moving through the underbrush. At first it was just a rustle, too faint to pin down, but it was enough to make them stop in their tracks. They turned around, scanning the fog, but saw nothing. Yet the sound persisted, growing louder, closer, as though something or someone was following their every move. Fear began to creep into their hearts. The stories they had laughed off now seemed all too real. And then, just as they were about to set up camp, one of the group members, Jake, disappeared. He had gone off to gather firewood, and when he didn't return, The others began to search for him. Fine. It didn't take long before they realized something was wrong. The forest had taken him. They called out his name, but there was no answer, only the oppressive silence that swallowed every sound they made. In that moment, they understood this was no ordinary forest. Something far older, far more dangerous was watching them, waiting for them to make their move. The tension that had been building throughout the day now exploded into full-blown panic. The group was lost, and they weren't just lost in a physical sense. They were lost in something much darker, something they could never have imagined. The forest wasn't just an unwelcoming place. It was alive, and it didn't want them to leave. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like the voices of those who had come before them, warning them of the fate that awaited those who dared to enter its depths. The fog rolled in thicker than ever, and with it came a sense of inevitability. They were no longer explorers, they were prey, and the forest was its hunter. It started with a dream. Sarah had always been the practical one in the group. While the others reveled in the thrill of the unknown, she was the one who checked the map, double-checked the gear, and made sure they didn't venture too far off course. But in that thick, damp fog of Oregon's wilderness, it was the fog inside her mind that began to close in on her first. It was subtle at first, a shadow in the corner of her vision, a fleeting figure darting between the trees, only to vanish the moment she tried to focus on it. But the dreams, they were different. They didn't vanish. They lingered. Every night as the group huddled together around the flickering campfire, Sarah would fall asleep only to be pulled back into the same haunting dream. It was always the same, an endless stretch of trees, twisted and gnarled like the arms of something ancient, reaching out toward her. She could feel the weight of the darkness suffocating her, pressing in from all sides. The silence in the dream was oppressive, no rustling leaves, no wind, only the echo of her own breath. And then they would appear, figures, pale and translucent, standing just beyond the reach of the trees. At first they were indistinct mere shapes, with no faces, moving like shadows. But as the dream progressed, their features became clearer. Their eyes, empty and hollow, seemed to burn with a desperation that made Sarah's heart race. They were pleading, their voices soft at first, but growing louder, more insistent, until they were practically screaming in her ears. "Help us, help us." Sarah would try to move, but her body wouldn't obey. She wanted to run, to escape, but she was rooted to the spot, unable to tear her eyes away from the figures in the woods. And every time, the dream would end the same way, with one of the figures stepping forward, its mouth opening in a silent scream, and then the overwhelming darkness would swallow her whole. At first, she tried to convince herself it was nothing more than the stress of the hike, the tension from the unexplained events they'd experienced earlier in the day. But as the dreams continued, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to them, something that felt real. It wasn't just the dreams that disturbed her, it was the overwhelming sense of dread that accompanied them. The figures, those ghostly shadows, were not benign. They weren't asking for help out of kindness or need. They were desperate, yes, but their desperation felt more like a warning than a plea. Each time she awoke, drenched in sweat and gasping for air, she couldn't help but wonder, what did they want from her? Why her? Sarah was no stranger to the concept of restless spirits. She had read about them in books, heard the stories from older relatives, and dismissed them as folklore, fabrications designed to keep children from wandering off into the dark. But these dreams, they were different. They felt like something more. The whispers of the forest seemed to seep into her mind while she slept, filling her with images of faces that had once been human, but now were little more than hollow shells of souls trapped in a nightmare. One night, after another restless sleep, Sarah woke up to find herself staring wide-eyed at the ceiling of their tent, heart pounding in her chest. The dream had been particularly vivid this time. One of the figures had reached out to her, its cold, transparent hand brushing against her arm. The sensation lingered like ice on her skin. she could still feel the chill as though it were real, as if it had crossed from the dream into the waking world. Unable to shake the feeling, she sat up, her breath shallow. The others were still asleep, the soft rhythm of their breathing blending with the sounds of the night. But Sarah couldn't relax. Something was wrong. The air in the tent felt thick, heavy with the same suffocating weight she had felt in the dream. She pulled on her jacket and crept out of the tent, hoping the cool night air would calm her nerves. Outside, the fog had settled in again, more densely than ever before, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches twisting and groaning in the wind. She glanced nervously over her shoulder, half expecting to see one of the figures standing behind her, waiting to emerge from the mist. But there was nothing, just the stillness of the forest, thick and oppressive. Still, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The dream had been so vivid, so real. And now, standing alone in the fog, she couldn't ignore the nagging sensation that she wasn't alone in the forest. That something or someone was lurking just beyond the reach of her vision, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became that the figures weren't just figments of her imagination. They were warnings. They were the souls of those who had wandered too deep into the forest, who had been consumed by it, trapped in its depths. And now they were trying to reach out to warn her, to beg for help. But what kind of help could she give them? How could she, one small, terrified person, change the fate of those whose souls had been lost to the wilderness? As Sarah stood in the damp night, staring into the fog, a chilling realization washed over her. It wasn't just her dreams that were leading her deeper into the forest. It was the forest itself. The very land seemed to call to her, drawing her closer with each step, pulling her toward the same fate as those lost souls who had come before her. She turned back to the tent, her mind racing with fear and confusion. The answers she sought seemed just out of reach, but the more she tried to resist, the stronger the pull became. The forest wasn't just haunting her dreams, it was coming for her piece by piece in the dead of night. And this time, Sarah wasn't sure if she'd wake up from it. As the group ventured deeper into the heart of Oregon's mysterious wilderness, the excitement and curiosity that had once propelled them forward began to morph into something darker, something that gnawed at the edges of their minds, turning every shadow into a threat. What had initially felt like an adventure now felt like a carefully laid trap, and every step seemed to bring them closer to an inescapable danger. At first it was small things, little flickers of movement in the peripheral vision, shadows darting between the trees that couldn't quite be explained. But then it escalated. One night, as the group sat around their campfire, the beams of their flashlights began to catch fleeting shapes, silhouettes that appeared and vanished just as quickly. At first, they brushed it off, too exhausted from the hike to think much of it. The forest was alive, after all, filled with creatures of the night. Yet, as the hours wore on, the figures became harder to ignore. They seemed to move with purpose, always just outside the reach of the light, just out of sight, but close enough to make their presence known. Jake, one of the group members, was the first to voice what they had all been silently dreading. "We're not alone out here," he said quietly, his voice strained with unease. "Someone or something is watching us." His words hung in the air, thick with the weight of their meaning. The others exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. It wasn't just a hunch, it was a creeping certainty that had settled into their bones. As they continued their trek, the feeling of being followed intensified. The sounds around them, once a comforting hum of nature, became disorienting. A branch snapping here, the rustle of leaves there, a soft brush against the underbrush that seemed far too deliberate to be an animal. And then the whispers. At first it was a faint murmur, like the wind speaking through the trees, but as they pressed on, it grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like words, but no one could make them out. It was as though something or someone was communicating in a language they couldn't understand, but the intent was unmistakable. They were being watched. Each time they stopped, the forest seemed to close in around them. The trees, which had once seemed like silent sentinels standing guard, now felt like they were leaning in, watching, listening, and the figures, those fleeting shadows, were becoming more frequent. The glow of the flashlights revealed little more than the same indistinct shapes, but now they lingered longer, closer, as though they were waiting for something, waiting for them to make a mistake. "I'm telling you," Sarah said, her voice tinged with growing panic. "We're walking into something. We're being led somewhere." It was impossible to ignore now. The sense of unease that had simmered under the surface was boiling over. They weren't just exploring the forest, they were being drawn in, like moths to a flame. The further they went, the more the air seemed to thicken, the weight of the forest pressing down on them. The trees, once majestic and welcoming, now felt oppressive, their twisted branches reaching out like fingers, their shadows growing longer with each passing hour. The whispers weren't just in their heads anymore, they were real, and they were growing louder, more urgent. Then, as they trudged through a particularly dense thicket, one of the group members, Mark, stumbled upon something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. It was a small clearing, one that hadn't been on their map, surrounded by trees so tightly packed they could barely see through. In the middle of the clearing was a strange formation, stone pillars arranged in a circle, worn smooth by years of exposure to the elements. The ground around them was disturbed, as if someone had been digging recently. Mark's flashlight flickered as he aimed it at the stones, casting an eerie glow on the uneven ground. "This wasn't here before," he murmured, stepping cautiously toward the circle of stones. "What is this place?" Sarah stepped forward, her flashlight tracing the stones as she scanned the ground. And that's when she saw it, a symbol carved into the stone, fresh and unmistakable. It wasn't a native symbol, nor was it anything she recognized from her studies of the forest. It was something different, darker, more sinister. "That's not good," Sarah muttered, her voice a whisper. The rest of the group crowded around, their eyes scanning the symbols, the unsettling arrangement of stones, the feeling that something was wrong, but they couldn't put it into words. They all felt it. That growing dread, like an invisible hand tightening around their throats. It wasn't just the forest anymore. It was as if the forest had become an active participant in their plight, setting traps, playing games with them. The figures they had seen, the whispers that had followed them. Everything seemed to be guiding them toward this place, toward this circle of stones. But why? What did it want from them? The realization hit them all at once. The forest was no longer just a passive witness to their exploration. It had become a predator, and they were its prey. They weren't just lost, they were being led deeper into the trap, step by step. And it wasn't the trees or the wildlife that posed the greatest danger. It was something far older, something far more dangerous. The spirits of the lost souls who had wandered here before them, who had been trapped by the very same forest, were using them to fill the empty spaces they had left behind. The whispers had become clearer now, and they were unmistakably human. "Help us," they begged. "Help us before it's too late." The tension between the group members was palpable. Fear gripped their hearts, and suspicion began to creep in. Who could they trust? Were they all hearing the same whispers? Were they all seeing the same things? It felt like the forest itself was twisting their perceptions, forcing them to question everything, what was real, what wasn't. And just as quickly as they had heard the voices, they fell silent again, leaving an unnerving stillness in their wake. The group stood there, frozen, the shadows of the trees pressing in on them from all sides. The figure of one of the spirits emerged from the corner of their vision, only to vanish as soon as they turned to look. A fleeting glimpse, a reminder that they were never alone. It was clear now. They were no longer just exploring a forest. They were trapped in a web of ancient forces, guided by the restless souls that roamed these woods. And the more they tried to escape, the tighter the trap became. But could they break free? Or had the forest already decided their fate? It happened so suddenly, so inexplicably, that it took a few moments for anyone to fully process what had occurred. One of the group, Jake, who had been joking and laughing only an hour before, was simply gone. There was no warning, no struggle. 1 minute he was there helping Sarah with the tent, and the next he had vanished into the thick fog that had rolled in with the evening. At first, they thought he was playing a prank. It made sense, didn't it? After all, they were in a strange place, far from civilization, and the forest had a way of disorienting them. Maybe he had wandered off to get a better view of the trees, or to find a quieter spot to think. But as the minutes passed, and then the hours, the joke lost its humor. It wasn't funny anymore. "Jake?" Sarah called out, her voice cracking with rising panic. The others joined her, calling his name, their voices becoming more strained with each unanswered shout. But there was no response, no sound, nothing to indicate that Jake was anywhere nearby. The fog had grown thicker since they last saw him, a dense swall of mist that seemed to swallow everything. It was as if the forest itself had closed in around them, obscuring their vision and muffling their voices. They began to search, splitting up into smaller groups, scanning the area with their flashlights, hoping to catch a glimpse of Jake, or at least some sign of where he had gone. But the forest seemed endless. It wasn't just the fog, it was something more, something deeper, something unsettling. The trees stood tall like dark sentinels, their gnarled branches twisting toward the sky, but there was no sign of life. Not even the wind stirred in the branches. It was as though the entire forest had gone silent, holding its breath, waiting. Minutes turned to hours, and still there was no sign of Jake. The search grew more and more desperate. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she called his name again, her voice trembling with fear. They checked the path, retraced their steps, and even tried calling him from different directions, but it was as though he had disappeared into thin air. Mark, always the level-headed one, tried to remain calm. "We need to stick together," he said, trying to reassure the group. "There's no sense in spreading out further. We'll find him." But the words felt hollow, even to him. As the group huddled together in the growing fog, their fear was palpable. They couldn't ignore the creeping suspicion that something wasn't right, that Jake's disappearance wasn't just a random accident. Something in the air felt heavy, like an unseen presence was watching them from the shadows, waiting, observing. As they continued to search, they began to find strange things, signs that couldn't be easily explained. A fallen tree, massive and ancient, its roots ripped from the ground as though something powerful had thrown it aside. The trunk was twisted in unnatural ways, as if it had been caught in the grip of an invisible force. The oddest part was the area around the tree. It wasn't the usual underbrush that you would expect to find in a forest. The ground was churned up like something had been dragged across deep, uneven gouges that led toward a darker patch of woods further into the forest. Sarah, shaken by the sight, crouched down and ran her fingers through the dirt. "This wasn't caused by wind or anything natural," she whispered, mostly to herself. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. There was no animal or storm large enough to cause damage like this. And yet, as she looked closer, she saw something even more disturbing, a set of footprints. They weren't Jake's, too large, too deep. The prints seemed fresh, as though someone or something had passed by recently. The strange thing was that they didn't lead anywhere. The tracks appeared out of nowhere, as if the creature, or whatever had made them, had simply materialized in the middle of the clearing. "Those weren't here before," Mark said, kneeling next to her. "There's no way Jake could have made them." "Who else could it be?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with dread. The other members of the group gathered around, their faces pale as they tried to make sense of the footprints. It was clear now Jake hadn't just wandered off. Something had taken him, something that was still here. The realization hit them like a cold wave. The forest wasn't just a place to explore, it was a predator, watching, waiting, luring them deeper into its tangled depths. The group continued their search, but with each passing minute, the sense of urgency grew. They called out for Jake again and again, but it felt futile. The fog had closed in completely now, the world reduced to a few feet of visibility at most. The air was thick with moisture, and every breath felt heavier than the last. The sounds of the forest seemed muffled, as if the world itself had been silenced by some unseen force. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Something was wrong, and they all knew it. But what could they do? They were deep in the heart of the wilderness, cut off from help, with no way of knowing what was out there, what had taken Jake, and why. Just as they were about to give up and head back toward camp, Sarah froze. There, through the fog, she saw movement, something at the edge of her flashlight's beam. She turned quickly, her heart racing, but the figure was gone, vanished as quickly as it had appeared. It wasn't Jake. It couldn't have been, but it was a shape, dark and fleeting, like a shadow moving just beyond the light. Her pulse quickened and she looked back at the others. "I saw something," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "There, just there, it was watching us." The others strained their eyes into the fog, but saw nothing. The silence that followed was deafening, filled only by the distant sound of their own breathing, but they all felt it, the presence. Something was there, and whatever it was waiting for them to make their next move. With no choice but to press on, they continued their search, the weight of their fear growing heavier with every passing step. But the deeper they went, the more they realized they weren't just looking for Jake anymore. They were looking for a way out of the forest, out of the nightmare that had begun to consume them. The sense of being watched intensified. They could hear the soft crunch of footsteps on the forest floor, too quiet to be from any of their own. The air felt thicker now, as if something was pressing in on them from all sides. They weren't alone, and as much as they tried to convince themselves that it was just the fog playing tricks on their minds, they knew deep down that it wasn't. The forest had a secret, a dark, twisted secret, and it wasn't about to let them go until it had claimed them, too. Sarah looked around, feeling the weight of her fear settle in her chest. We need to leave, now. But the forest wasn't going to let them go that easily. The air had grown thick with unease, the fog now a suffocating blanket that seemed to draw closer around them with every passing moment. The group had been searching for hours, calling out for Jake, but with each passing second their hope grew dimmer, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. The trees, which had once seemed like natural guardians of the forest, now seemed like silent, looming figures watching, waiting. Every rustle in the distance, every shifting shadow was a reminder that something in this forest wasn't right. It wasn't just their imagination anymore. They were being hunted. It was Mark who first found the clue that would unravel the terrifying truth. Mark, always the rational one, had been leading the group further into the dense thicket when he stumbled upon something that made his blood run cold. It was an old, weathered sign, half buried under a pile of leaves, its surface chipped and faded by years of exposure. He knelt down to clear the debris, revealing a crude symbol carved into the wood. It wasn't the symbol of the native tribes or any mark they had seen before. This was something darker, something much older. "Hey Sarah, look at this," Mark called out, his voice sharp with a mix of curiosity and dread. Sarah moved closer, shining her flashlight over the symbol. She frowned as she recognized the shape, an upside-down triangle, surrounded by jagged lines like claws. The symbol was unfamiliar to her, but it didn't take long for the realization to hit her with full force. This wasn't just a marking, it was a warning of something far worse lurking in the forest. "The symbol," Sarah started, her voice trembling. "It looks like it's a warning. We need to get out of here." Mark, still studying the symbol, muttered under his breath. "What if this is something from the past? Something connected to the disappearances?" Sarah turned to face him, a growing horror settling in her chest. "What are you talking about?" Mark hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I did some reading before this trip about the forest. There are stories, rumors, things that were never fully investigated. People said this place, this forest, was once the site of horrific murders. Entire families had vanished here without a trace. No one knew what happened, but there were whispers of spirits, of vengeful ghosts that never moved on. And the strangest part, No one dared to investigate further. The authorities called it a string of unsolved disappearances, but I think it's something far worse than that. These were not random murders, Sarah. These were people, lost souls, trapped in this forest, seeking revenge. The words hung in the air, thick with the realization that they weren't just lost in a forest. They were caught in something much darker, something ancient, something that had never truly let go of the land. As the others gathered around, their faces pale with disbelief, the fog thickened around them, turning the world into a blur of indistinct shapes. The air grew colder, and a low, chilling wind began to whistle through the branches, as though the forest itself was mourning the souls that had been lost here. And then, as if on cue, the first ghost appeared. At first, it was just a shape, a faint, shadowy figure flickering in the corner of their vision. But as they turned to look, it became clearer. A pale face, hollow eyes staring into theirs, its mouth hanging open in a silent scream. The figure was translucent, its body flickering like an old film reel, the edges of its form dissolving into the mist. The figure reached out toward them, its hand skeletal and outstretched. But when they tried to take a step back, they realized they couldn't. They were frozen in place, unable to move, paralyzed by the sheer terror that gripped their bodies. One by one, the group began to see it. The figures that had once been shadows in the periphery, now unmistakably clear, taking shape in the fog. Ghostly apparitions of men, women, and children, all with hollow eyes, standing just out of reach, their mouths moving in silent pleas. Some reached out toward them, others seemed to watch from a distance, their faces frozen in expressions of agony and anger. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered, her voice quivering with fear. These are the people from the stories." Mark nodded, his eyes wide with terror. "They're not just stories, Sarah. These are the souls of the lost. They never moved on." Before anyone could respond, a piercing scream cut through the air, loud, raw, and filled with such desperation that it sent chills down their spines. The group turned, but no one was there. The scream echoed, growing louder and louder until it seemed to come from every direction at once. The fog swirled in a violent whirlpool, twisting and distorting the world around them. Suddenly, one of the figures, the ghost of a man with hollow eyes and an expression of rage, lunged forward. It moved with an unnatural speed, crossing the distance between them in an instant, its hand shooting out to grab hold of Jake. But Jake wasn't there. Instead, the ghost's icy fingers latched onto Sarah's arm, its touch colder than anything she had ever felt. She screamed, the chill of its touch seeping deep into her skin. The others tried to pull her away, but it was no use. The ghost's grip tightened, and Sarah felt herself being pulled forward toward the figure. It was as if the forest itself was alive, feeding on their fear, growing stronger with each passing moment. "We need to go," Mark shouted, grabbing Sarah and pulling her back. But it was too late. The ghost wasn't letting go, and the more they struggled, the more they realized this wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight against something far older, far more powerful than anything they could have imagined. The ghosts weren't just victims of the past, they were the hunters now, and they had come to claim them, one by one. In a desperate panic, the group backed away, their hearts pounding, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees now looming like twisted giants. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shift and change, leading them deeper into the forest, further away from the path they had come. Sarah looked back, and the ghost was still there, its face twisted in a snarl of hatred, its eyes locked onto her, refusing to let go. And as they ran, the forest seemed to pulse with an unearthly energy, its whispers growing louder, more insistent, as if it was trying to tell them something. But what? The answer came too late. The ghosts were not just lost souls. They were the ones in control now, guiding their every move, leading them further into the heart of the darkness. The group had become part of the forest's curse, trapped in an endless nightmare where escape was impossible. And as the trees closed in, Sarah realized the horrifying truth. The forest was not just a place. It was a prison, and they were its prisoners. The forest, once an imposing but manageable landscape, had begun to morph into something much darker, much more oppressive with every step the group took. What started as an innocent exploration, driven by curiosity and the thrill of adventure, was rapidly turning into something far worse, something they could neither escape nor understand. The deeper they ventured into the heart of the Oregon wilderness, the more the very air around them seemed to tighten, pressing in on them like a vice. The path they had followed seemed to vanish beneath their feet, swallowed by the ever-thickening fog, and the trees, once silent sentinels, now seemed to loom like giants, watching, waiting. Every rustle of the leaves, every creaking branch, every snap of twigs underfoot sounded like a warning, yet the group could see nothing, hear nothing, beyond the thickening mist that swallowed up their surroundings. Each step felt heavier than the last, their hearts now racing with the growing sense that they weren't just lost. They were being pulled into something ancient and unforgiving, and there was no way out. The silence that had enveloped the forest was quickly shattered, not by the sounds of wildlife or the usual chorus of nature, but by something else, something far more disturbing. A high-pitched scream, long and drawn out, tore through the air, echoing off the trees. It was a scream of agony, one that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself, vibrating through their bones. For a moment, the group stood frozen, their eyes wide with terror, straining to hear any other sounds that might explain the scream, but nothing came. There was no wind, no rustle of leaves, just that deafening silence that seemed to stretch on for eternity. "Did you hear that?" Sarah's voice cracked as she whispered. The question, though they all knew the answer. They had heard it, how could they not? That scream had been impossible to ignore. But what was it? Who or what could make such a sound in the middle of this desolate forest? Before anyone could respond, another sound echoed through the trees. This time, it was different. The scream was replaced by laughter. It started low, almost inaudible, as if it were coming from far away, but it grew louder with each passing second, becoming louder and louder, more jarring, until it was all-consuming, filling the space around them. It was a hollow, cold laugh, devoid of any joy, a laugh that seemed to reverberate from all directions, as though it were coming from every shadow, from every crack in the trees. It was the kind of laughter that sends a chill up your spine, the kind that makes your skin crawl. "Who's there?" Mark called out, his voice shaky but desperate. His flashlight swept back and forth, trying to pierce the thick fog. But it revealed nothing, just trees, more trees, and the ever-present mist. The group looked around nervously, but there was no one in sight. And yet, that laughter continued, echoing through the forest, growing more distinct with each passing moment. As the laughter continued to ring in their ears, the group began to feel something else, something far more visceral than fear. It was a pull, a tug at their very souls, as if something was trying to draw them deeper into the heart of the forest. Each step they took forward felt as though they were walking in slow motion, as if the ground beneath their feet had grown heavier, more resistant, trying to hold them back. And yet, they couldn't stop. It was like they were trapped in a dream, caught in the clutches of something they couldn't control, being dragged further and further into the unknown. And then it happened. One of the figures, a shadow moving just beyond the reach of their flashlights, materialized before them. At first, it was just a flicker, a brief movement in the corner of their vision, but then, as if it had been waiting for them to notice, it stepped forward into the light. It was a figure draped in tattered, ghostly garments, its face pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes staring out from under a hood. The figure didn't speak, but it didn't need to. Its presence was enough. The group froze, unable to move, unable to look away. The figure stood there for what felt like an eternity, its eyes boring into them, as though it were waiting for something, waiting for them to make the next move. But there was no next move. The air had grown thick with fear, and none of them could bring themselves to speak. The figure didn't move either. It simply stood, staring at them, its eyes empty, hollow. And in that moment, they knew this was no ordinary ghost. This was the spirit of someone who had died here, in this very forest. Someone whose soul had never found peace, trapped between the living and the dead. It wasn't just watching them, it was waiting for them to become part of its eternal torment. "Keep moving," Mark finally whispered, his voice tight with fear. "Don't stop. Don't look back." But it was too late. As soon as he spoke, the figure vanished, dissipating into the fog as though it had never been there at all. The laughter continued, louder now, more frantic, as though it were mocking them for thinking they could escape. The group took a hesitant step forward, but before they could move further, another figure appeared, this time on the opposite side of them, emerging from the thick mist. This one was taller, its form more defined, its eyes blazing with a fiery intensity. It was a man, but his face was twisted, distorted in a way that was unnatural. His mouth was open, wide, as if screaming, but no sound came out. The sight of him made their stomachs turn, as though the very fabric of reality was bending and warping in front of them. There was no escape. The forest had closed in around them, and they were trapped. The ghosts, the lost souls, were all around them now, flickering in and out of existence, their faces twisted in agony, their bodies stretched and deformed. They were not the spirits of people who had died. They were the remnants of those who had been trapped in this forest, unable to move on, unable to find peace. With each new ghost that appeared, the group realized the horrifying truth. They weren't just being hunted, they were being drawn into the very same nightmare that had claimed the others before them. They were becoming part of the forest curse, trapped in an endless cycle of terror, just like the souls who had come before them. Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest as she turned to the others. "We need to get out of here," she gasped, her voice barely more than a whisper. "We have to leave, now." But as they began to move, another figure appeared, blocking their path. This one was no longer a shadow, it was solid, real, its form unmistakably human. But the face, oh God, the face was nothing more than a mask of twisted agony. Its eyes were wide, unblinking, and its mouth was frozen in a silent scream. The group was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by the sheer horror of it all. And in that moment they realized the truth. This wasn't just a forest. It was a prison, and they were its prisoners, just like the others who had been lost before them. The laughter, the whispers, the ghosts, they were all part of the forest's curse, and the group was now part of it too. With each step deeper into the forest, the group's sense of reality began to fragment. What had once been a simple journey of exploration had now become a nightmarish struggle to survive. The trees, once towering giants in a serene wilderness, had morphed into something sinister, silent sentinels that seemed to watch them from every angle. The fog, thick and unrelenting, surrounded them like an impenetrable wall, and the distant echoes of screams, laughter, and whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The group had long since stopped looking for an exit. They no longer thought about how to get out. They were consumed by the primal instinct to survive, to simply keep moving forward, even though each new twist and turn seemed to bring them closer to the heart of the terror. They weren't exploring the forest anymore. They were trapped in it, bound by its ancient curse, caught between the world of the living and the restless spirits who inhabited the land. And then came the realization. It wasn't just a forest. It wasn't merely a place of survival. It was a battleground, a brutal war zone where the world of the living collided with the world of the dead. The spirits, the ghosts, had taken form and had made this place their home, their prison, and their battleground. The veil between the two worlds had grown thin, too thin, and the ghosts that once wandered aimlessly now appeared with purpose. Their restless souls had been caught in a state of limbo, unable to move on, unable to find peace. And they were angry. As if to prove this horrifying truth, the ghosts began to manifest more frequently, appearing in every corner of their vision. They weren't just shadows anymore. They were real and frightening, with faces twisted in torment, their bodies flickering in and out of existence. They seemed to be following them, circling them, closing in. Every time the group thought they were safe, another ghost would appear, louder, angrier, more desperate than the last. The air was filled with the sounds of their cries, the relentless moans of souls trapped between worlds. But it wasn't just the ghosts that terrified them, it was the feeling of being hunted. The group was no longer wandering through a forest. They were being chased, pursued by an unseen force. The very trees seemed to shift around them, blocking their path, pushing them further into the unknown. The fog seemed to grow thicker with each passing moment, its suffocating presence making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Every step felt like a step deeper into the unknown, into the heart of the battlefield that lay ahead. It wasn't long before the group's fear began to turn to panic. They had lost track of time, lost track of each other. The forest had become a maze, and no matter how much they tried to retrace their steps, the path was always different. The trees were the same, the fog the same, but the landscape itself seemed to shift, change, as if the forest was deliberately playing tricks on them. The rules of the world they knew no longer applied here. And then one of them disappeared. It happened so suddenly, so unexpectedly, that it took a moment for anyone to comprehend what had occurred. Jake had been walking ahead, scouting a path through the trees. He'd been just out of sight for a moment, his form vanishing into the dense fog. But when the others called out for him, when they looked around for any sign of him, he was gone. No trace, no footprints, no sign of struggle. It was as if the forest had swallowed him whole, consumed him without a trace. The group was left standing in stunned silence, their minds racing to understand what had just happened. "Jake!" they shouted, their voices tinged with fear. They called his name over and over, but the only response they received was the eerie silence of the forest. There was no answer, no sound of footsteps, nothing to suggest he was anywhere nearby. It was as if the forest itself had taken him, and now they were left alone in its grip. Panic set in quickly. What had just happened? Where had Jake gone? The group frantically searched the area, looking for any clues, any sign of where he might have gone, but there was nothing. No disturbance in the underbrush, no broken branches, no signs of a struggle. It was as if he had simply vanished, swallowed up by the forest itself. As they continued their search, a terrifying thought began to creep into their minds. This wasn't just a random disappearance. This was part of something bigger, something far more terrifying than they had ever imagined. The spirits, the angry souls of the lost, weren't just haunting the forest, they were hunting them. The group wasn't just being watched, they were being stalked. The forest had become a battleground, and they were the prey. As if to confirm their worst fears, the atmosphere grew even more oppressive. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly, and a cold wind began to howl through the trees. The fog grew thicker, wrapping itself around them like a living thing. The air was thick with the scent of decay, of death. The distant cries of the ghosts became louder, more insistent, their voices rising in a crescendo of anguish. They were closing in, the spirits of the lost souls pulling the group deeper into the heart of the nightmare. Sarah's heart raced as she turned to the others, her voice shaking with fear. "We need to leave, now. This is not just a forest. It's a prison." Mark nodded, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. "It's a trap. We're being led into a trap." The group began to move again, their steps quickening as they tried to escape the tightening grip of the forest. But it was too late. The path ahead seemed to disappear before their eyes, the trees blocking their way, the ground shifting beneath their feet. No matter which direction they turned, the forest was always one step ahead, always leading them deeper into its dark heart. And that's when they saw it. A figure standing in the distance, cloaked in shadow. At first it was just a faint shape, a shadow flickering in the corner of their vision, but as they got closer, it became clear. It was a ghost, a soul lost to the forest, standing in their way. Its face was twisted in an expression of anger, its mouth open in a silent scream. The group froze, their fear rising to a new height. The ghost didn't move at first. It simply stood there, watching them, its hollow eyes fixed on them. But the longer they stared at it, the more they realized it wasn't just watching them, it was waiting for them to take one more step, one more mistake, before it closed in for the kill. "We have to get out of here," Sarah shouted, turning to the others. "We can't stay here. The forest it's alive. It's a battlefield, and we're the ones being hunted." The reality of their situation hit them all at once. There was no escape. They weren't just lost in a forest. They were trapped in a war between the living and the dead, a war that they had no hope of winning. The spirits of the lost had claimed this land, and they weren't going to let them go. They were no longer explorers. They were prey. The forest closed in around them, the ghosts growing bolder, their forms flickering more frequently, appearing and disappearing as if toying with them. The world had become a blur of shadows and screams, of twisting trees and rising terror. The group had walked into a nightmare, and now, it seemed, there was no way out. They were stuck in the heart of a battleground, caught between two worlds, with nowhere to run. The forest had become their prison, suffocating, twisted labyrinth that seemed to shift with every passing moment. What had once been a group of adventurers, eager to explore the mysteries of the wilderness, was now a small, broken band of survivors. The others were gone, lost to the relentless grasp of the forest and its vengeful spirits. Only a few remained, their faces gaunt with exhaustion, their eyes hollow with fear. They had tried everything, shouting, running, hiding, but nothing worked. The forest didn't just trap them, it toyed with them, feeding on their fear, pushing them deeper into its dark heart. The situation had grown desperate, the oppressive fog, the phantom laughter, the cries of souls lost to time. Everything had converged into a singular, inescapable truth. If they wanted to survive, they had to confront the spirits head-on. There was no escape anymore. The forest wasn't just a place, they had become part of it. They had walked into a nightmare, and the only way out was through the very source of that nightmare. It was Mark who first realized this, his mind sharp despite the haze of fear clouding his thoughts. He had spent countless hours poring over the journal of the one person who had ever survived the forest, a man whose words were now the group's only hope. The journal, hidden deep within the remains of an old cabin, contained details of the forest's curse and the rituals that could break it. It was their only chance, a desperate ancient ritual that, if performed correctly, could appease the spirits and allow them to escape the forest's grip. "We have to do it," Mark said, his voice barely more than a whisper. The others turned to him, their faces etched with disbelief. He could see the hesitation in their eyes, the fear that they would be too late, that even trying the ritual would seal their fate. But Mark's resolve was unwavering. They had no choice. The spirits were closing in, and every second they wasted brought them closer to becoming one of the lost souls themselves. "What do we have to do?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky, but her eyes searching for a spark of hope. Mark's fingers trembled as he held up the journal, the pages yellowed with age and frail with time. "This," he said, pointing to the handwritten words, "this ritual is the only way to break the curse, to set the spirits free. If we can do it before the forest completely claims us, we might survive." The words on the page were cryptic, but the meaning was clear enough. The ritual required them to perform an offering, a symbol of their willingness to sacrifice something precious to them in order to appease the angry spirits. But it was more than just a physical offering. The ritual demanded something deeper, the acceptance of their own fears, the acknowledgement of the suffering of the lost souls, and the courage to face what had been buried in the forest for centuries. Sarah took a deep breath, her heart racing as she scanned the page. "And what happens if we fail? What if it's too late?" Mark looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "If we fail, we become part of the forest. We'll join the others, trapped forever in this nightmare." The weight of his words settled in the air between them. No one spoke for a long moment, the quiet only broken by the distant echoes of the spirits. Their cries were louder now, their anger more palpable. It was as though the forest itself was urging them on, demanding that they face the inevitable. "I'll do it," Sarah finally said, stepping forward. Her voice was steady now, her fear transformed into resolve. "I'll be the one to do the ritual. I won't let us die here." Mark nodded, his respect for her clear in his eyes. "We'll help you," he said. "We'll do this together." The group gathered around, their hands trembling as they set up the ritual site. The trees around them seemed to close in, the fog swirling tighter, as though the very forest itself was watching. They placed the offerings, a small pile of stones, symbolic of their sacrifices, at the center of the clearing. The ancient words from the journal spilled from their lips, their voices trembling but unified. They recited the incantation, their hearts pounding as the energy in the air shifted, the forest around them seeming to grow darker, heavier. And then something changed. At first, it was subtle, just a flicker of movement in the trees, a slight shift in the wind. But as they continued the ritual, the presence of the spirits grew stronger, the forest around them seeming to pulse with life, like a heart beating beneath the earth. The air grew colder, and Sarah could feel the weight of the spirits pressing against her, their anger and desperation wrapping around her like chains. But she didn't falter. She could feel their pain, their torment, and she knew that this was the only way to set them free. As the last words of the ritual were spoken, the ground beneath them trembled, and a deafening silence fell over the forest. The spirits, the ghosts that had been haunting them, began to manifest in full form, their faces twisted in agony, their bodies translucent and flickering. They were angry, furious even, but there was something else in their eyes too, a recognition, a thank you. And then the forest seemed to shift. The oppressive fog that had swallowed them for days began to dissipate, lifting like a veil being pulled from their eyes. The trees that had seemed so dark and threatening now looked like old friends, their branches no longer reaching out to grab them, but standing still, like silent witnesses to the ritual. But the ghosts didn't disappear. Instead, they began to fade, one by one, their faces softening, their bodies becoming more transparent until they were nothing more than wisps of light drifting into the sky. They had been freed, and in doing so, the forest itself began to release its grip on the survivors. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. The group stood there breathless, eyes wide with disbelief. They had done it. They had confronted the spirits, faced their fears, and broken the curse. The air around them felt different, lighter, clearer, as if a weight had been lifted from their shoulders. But even in the peace that followed, they knew one thing for certain. They were not the same people who had entered the forest. They had been changed by it, molded by the horror they had faced. And as they turned to leave, they couldn't help but look back at the forest one last time. It had given them a chance to survive, but it had also shown them the true cost of survival. The Oregon wilderness had become their battlefield, but they had won. For now, the ritual had reached its most critical moment, and the forest was alive with the energy of the spirits who had been awakened by their words, their actions. What had started as a quiet prayer, an act of desperation to break free from the curse that had trapped them, had now spiraled into something far more dangerous. The air was thick with a malignant presence, the trees around them bending unnaturally, the fog swirling faster, as if responding to the call of the spirits. The winds carried whispers, fragments of ancient voices pleading, growling, screaming with rage. The group was no longer just performing the ritual. They were being drawn into a violent struggle, fighting not just for survival, but for their very souls. Sarah stood at the center of the circle, clutching the symbols from the journal, her hand trembling. Every inch of her skin prickled with the heavy weight of unseen eyes. The forest was watching them, but it wasn't just the trees or the animals. No, it was the spirits, the souls of the lost, the angry ones who had been waiting for centuries for someone to disturb their slumber, and disturb them they had. As the incantations continued, the spirits grew restless, their presence becoming more corporeal, their forms more distinct. They materialized out of the mist, their faces twisted in agony, their bodies flickering in and out of existence like burning embers caught in the wind. The spirits were relentless, their vengeance fueling their every movement. They were angry, bitter, and unyielding in their pursuit of the living. The group tried to hold their ground, chanting the final words from the journal, but the ghosts fought back, their energy crashing into them like waves in a storm. Every step they took, every word they uttered, seemed to make the spirits more vicious. It was as if the very act of attempting to free them was fueling their wrath, pushing them to retaliate with all the power they had. One of the spirits lunged forward, its skeletal hand reaching for Sarah. She gasped, stepping back, but the grip was too strong, too fierce. The chill of its touch sent an icy shock through her body, and for a moment she thought she might be pulled into the void, lost forever with the others who had fallen prey to the forest's curse. Mark grabbed her arm, yanking her back, but the spirit was relentless. It reached for him next, its hollow eyes burning with an intensity that made his breath catch in his throat. "Keep going," he shouted, his voice filled with desperation. "We're almost there." Despite the chaos around them, despite the vengeful spirits clawing at their very souls, the group continued. The incantation wasn't just a way to banish the ghosts. It was their only hope, their only chance to undo the damage they had unwittingly unleashed. But it wasn't enough. The spirits were too strong, their anger too deep. They had been trapped here for too long, and their desire for revenge was all-consuming. With every passing second, the ritual felt more like a losing battle, but they couldn't stop. Not now, not when the end was so close. Then, as the final words of the ritual spilled from their lips, something shifted. The ground trembled, a low rumble echoing through the forest, as though the earth itself was protesting their actions. The mist thickened, swirling violently around them, and for a moment the world seemed to stop. The air grew heavy, suffocating, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. And then, from the darkness, a single voice cut through the silence. It wasn't the voice of just any spirit. This one was different. It was deeper, more powerful, as though it had been waiting for this moment for centuries. The voice reverberated through the very ground beneath their feet, shaking them to their core. It was a voice that spoke not in words, but in emotions, a voice that made them feel the weight of an entire history of suffering. "Fools," the voice said, its tone dripping with venom. "You think you can escape the curse? You think you can free the spirits of the forest? No, you are mistaken. The forest is not just a prison for the lost souls. It is the keeper of the balance between the living and the dead. It was never meant to be disturbed. Your ritual, your trespass, has not freed us. It has bound you to us." The realization hit them like a tidal wave. The forest wasn't just a place where souls were trapped. It was the very boundary between life and death. It was a force that had kept the two realms separate, preventing the souls from moving on, but also preventing them from wreaking havoc on the living. By attempting to free the spirits, they hadn't broken the curse, they had become part of it. "No," Sarah whispered, the horror of the revelation sinking in. She looked around, but the mist seemed to grow thicker, suffocating. The spirits weren't just ghosts. They were guardians of the forest's secret, its purpose. The ritual wasn't meant to set them free. It was meant to keep the balance intact, to maintain the delicate line between life and death. By invoking the ritual, they had threatened that balance, and now they were trapped in it. And then the voice spoke again, its tone even colder, more final. "You will never leave. The forest will consume you as it has consumed the others. You are bound to it now as we are. There is no escape. You are part of the forest. You are part of the curse." The realization was like a punch to the gut. There was no way out. They had walked into a battle that was never meant to be won. The spirits didn't want freedom, they wanted to keep the forest curse intact, to keep the barrier between life and death. from crumbling. The group had tried to free them, but in doing so, they had condemned themselves. They weren't just trying to escape, they were now part of the very thing they had been trying to break. As the last of the ritual's energy faded, the spirits grew still, their forms becoming more solid, their faces twisting in unholy satisfaction. They had won. The group's final hope had turned to dust, their struggle for survival a futile attempt against a force older than time itself. The forest had claimed them, just as it had claimed so many before them. The battle was over, but it was a battle they had never truly understood. The forest, its spirits, its curse it, was all part of a cycle that could never be broken. And now the group had become part of that cycle, trapped forever in the limbo between the living and the dead. After what felt like an eternity trapped within the suffocating fog of Oregon's cursed wilderness, the remaining survivors finally saw the faint glimmer of daylight. They had pushed through the forest, stumbling over roots and climbing over jagged rocks, desperate to find any hint of a path that could lead them out. The ghosts had not been far behind, their chilling presence following them every step of the way, but somehow they had managed to break free from the grips of the spirits that had plagued them. When they emerged from the dense forest and into the open space beyond, the sight of the world outside was both a relief and a shock. The air felt fresher, the sun, though barely visible behind thick clouds, finally casting a dim light on their weary faces. They were free. They had escaped the horror of the forest, or so they thought. But as they looked at each other, a cold realization washed over them. They didn't feel the same. Their faces, once familiar, now seemed distant, altered, haunted. The exhaustion was apparent in their eyes, but it was more than just fatigue. There was a depth to their gazes, a hollowness that hadn't been there before. Their expressions had shifted as if they carried the weight of the spirits they had encountered. One of them, Sarah, looked into the reflection of a nearby stream and recoiled. Her eyes were not her own anymore. They had changed. The reflection staring back at her wasn't the person who had entered the forest weeks ago. Full of hope and curiosity, it was someone else, someone marked by the ghosts that had haunted them. The others noticed the same thing. The marks of the spirits, their presence, etched into their very souls, now part of them forever. A silence fell over the group. Had they truly escaped, or had they become something else entirely? The forest was not just a place they had left behind. It had become a part of them, imprinted on their very beings. They had survived, yes, but at what cost? The thought lingered unspoken as they stood in the quiet aftermath, unsure of what to feel, relief, fear, or something darker. With heavy hearts, they made their way further into the world, beyond the forest. Each step away from the nightmare, a small victory, yet each step leaving behind an unsettling doubt. Had they truly left the cursed place behind, or had they simply become part of its endless cycle? The questions burned in their minds, unanswered, as they moved forward into the unknown, the unanswered question. The journey didn't end with their escape. It couldn't. The forest's grip on them had not loosened. It had merely shifted, transformed into something more insidious. They were no longer just survivors. They were now the carriers of its curse, the bearers of the spirit's wrath. The true cost of their escape had yet to reveal itself fully. As they walked further away from the forest, the air seemed to grow colder again, and the light began to dim, though the sun had been shining brightly a moment before. A strange sensation washed over them, like a whisper at the back of their minds, a pull beckoning them back to the forest. Had they truly broken free, or had they merely walked into a new form of torment? The spirits might have allowed them to leave the physical bounds of the forest, but were they still trapped within it, in their minds, in their very souls? The tension in the air was palpable, but there was no turning back. The forest had already claimed them. As they moved farther from its edge, they couldn't shake the sense that they were not truly free. Were the spirits really gone, or had they merely been waiting, patient, biding their time? Could they ever be released from the forest's summon curse, Or would the cycle continue forever, with the group becoming a part of the stories the forest told? The unanswered questions gnawed at them, and though they were physically free, the haunting uncertainty remained. Was the forest really behind them, or was it still waiting, watching, for the day when the curse would come full circle? The final shot, as they continued to walk, was of their faces, etched with the experience, with the knowledge that the truth had yet to fully surface. The camera lingered, focusing on their haunted eyes, filled with the terror of not knowing. They had escaped the forest, yes, but they could not escape the truth that still eluded them. Had they truly left, or had they become part of the forest's twisted legacy? The screen faded to black, leaving the question open-ended. The curse was not over. The spirits were not free. The forest's dark, whispering presence would always be with them. Would they ever find peace? Or would the forest's curse follow them, as it had followed so many before them? The story of Oregon's haunted wilderness was far from finished. It was only just beginning.